There was also a convention that was held in Hobart for over 700 journalists, which once again very conveniently allowed for a huge number of press to be available to attend Port Arthur immediately during and after the massacre. These reporters were bussed into the site and were in many ways escorted onto what would really be forensic sites that should be kept clear during examination, in essence trampling the evidence. But there were hundreds of journalists immediately available to report on Port Arthur, which was once again very convenient. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. In presenting an investigation into a crime such as Port Arthur, detractors sometimes present the concept of Occam's razor, which is a psychological term designed to explain a certain circumstance. In essence, in the context of an investigation into something like Port Arthur, it would put forward the notion that if there is a determination made, that leaping to assumptions and conjecture about that determination basically takes you away from the truth of that determination in the first place. So Occam's razor is often used to discredit any investigation into Port Arthur. Opposing that is synchronicity, which is another psychological term that was coined by Carl Jung. The notion really that if there is an ongoing trail of synchronized events or circumstances that suggest an alternative outcome, that has merit and that could possibly lead to the notion that that assumption therefore does carry water, because of the notion that there are so many synchronized events indicating an alternate reality. Might sound a little bit confusing, but in the case of Port Arthur, there are a ton of coincidences or events and circumstances that you would consider to be synchronicity. So we're going to go through those. The famous quote at the time by the then New South Wales Premier Barry Unsworth, that there would never be uniform gun laws in Australia unless there was a massacre in Tasmania, has often been brought up as an indication of possible foreknowledge that there was going to be a massacre at Port Arthur. Coincidentally, it could have just been an off-the-shoulder comment by a premier, because at the time there was a federal move to implement national gun laws. The only issue with that was that some of the states didn't want to fall in line with those directives, and so there was a lot of back and forward. Principally the two states that had the most liberal gun laws at the time, which were Queensland and Tasmania, were in opposition to some of the requirements from the federal government. So a premier stating something like, there'll never be any uniform gun laws unless there's a massacre in Tasmania, may have just been commenting on the fact that Tasmanians at the time loved their guns and Queenslanders loved their guns, and that they weren't prepared to budge. Nevertheless, it is a coincidence. A very vocal gun advocate by the name of Roland Brown, also before Port Arthur, made the comment that there would be a massacre in Tasmania. So there are two examples where people that were predisposing that there may have been an incident that would occur at Port Arthur that would involve multiple deaths by firearms. Other coincidences, of which there were many, we all know about the famous morgue truck. Ray Charlton, which was one of the coroners at the time, in 1995 had commissioned the construction of a 22-person refrigerated morgue truck, the purpose of which was to transport any victims from any mass trauma event under refrigeration for examination by the coroner's office. At the time, there was incredulity about the construction of such a vehicle, given that at the time Port Arthur had, a very low number of deaths, and it was mentioned that Victoria and New South Wales, which had much higher death rates overall per state, didn't have such a vehicle. In fact, no other vehicle existed in any other state in Australia. Needless to say, after Port Arthur and after the massacre, very fortuitously, there was a 22-person refrigerated truck to be able to transport the victims to the coroner's office for examination. As an afterthought to that, you would imagine that if a vehicle was that beneficial to looking after the coronial requirements of a crime or an event, that it would be held onto, but that was not the case. After Port Arthur, the vehicle was advertised for sale. A notification was placed by an ex-police officer under the name C.W. Wright, who had advertised the vehicle as the vehicle that was used at Port Arthur to transport the bodies, even mentioning that it could be used for reenactment or film purposes. The vehicle did not sell, however, and the last reports were that the refrigerated component of the truck had been removed and placed on a trailer, and that the whereabouts of that trailer haven't been known to this day. On the day, which was Sunday, the 28th of April, sunny Sunday afternoon at Port Arthur, there were some other interesting anomalies that occurred. One of which was that some of the main organisers and managers of the Port Arthur historical site, which was a government-run site, were requested to leave the site on that Sunday and pack an overnight bag so that they could basically have a convention off-site and a conference about the management of the site. This was to occur at 11 a.m. on that Sunday. So very conveniently, and luckily for those people, some of the main heads of the Port Arthur historical site were not there on the day at the time that the massacre occurred. Similarly, in Hobart, there was a convention that was held which was attended by quite a number of trauma surgeons from all over the country. The convention was to deal with the experiences of dealing with mass trauma events. So there was quite a number of highly respected and highly trained trauma surgeons who had attended that convention in Hobart, who were then on hand to be able to deal with the victims that were brought in from Port Arthur. In the same way, the Hobart Hospital had just implemented Code Brown. Code Brown was, once again, a protocol for the hospital to initiate in the event of an influx of mass trauma victims, so that the hospital would have a procedure and know exactly how to go into effect to take care of a large number of victims being brought in. Wendy Skua, who was an employee at the site and a pivotal person who's called for a coronial inquest into Port Arthur, had made notice of the fact that someone had ordered 200 army blankets to be delivered to Port Arthur prior to the massacre on the day. No one knew who had sent those blankets, but they were apparently stored at the site in the event that a large number of blankets would be needed to be able to cover victims or people who were injured with. On the day, Wendy basically put the call out for those blankets to be utilised, and it took some time for somebody to try and locate those blankets. Once again, the origins of who sent them and who ordered them and why they ordered them has never really been known or discussed in court or in any kind of proceedings. There was also an unusual number of helicopters available on the day at Port Arthur. Helicopters were generally, aside from some sightseeing tours and things, a bit of a rarity. One of the police officers who was held at siege at Seascape and under fire from the gunman in the cottage, at the Seascape cottage, was lying on his back and remarking that the amount of helicopters that were circling overhead, he said, "I always wanted to visit Beirut." So there was a large number of helicopters that were available, which were there to do everything from transport victims to the hospital, to be able to get aerial reconnoitre of the area and to, basically examine the site. There was also a convention that was held in Hobart for over 700 journalists, which, once again, very conveniently allowed for a huge number of press to be available to attend Port Arthur immediately during and after the massacre. These reporters were bussed into the site and were in many ways escorted onto what would really be construed to be forensic sites that should be kept clear during examination, in essence trampling the evidence. But there were hundreds of journalists immediately available to report on Port Arthur, which was once again very convenient. Reports have also surfaced and been verified about a second Volvo that was in attendance at the site on the day. Now, the very highly recognisable signature vehicle that was owned by Martin Bryant, which was a early model yellow Volvo sedan, which was very easily recognisable by people and which was used to transport the gunman away, both to Port Arthur, on the way to Port Arthur, and away from Port Arthur towards the other crime sites like the toll booth, was identified and picked up by many people. There was also a second yellow Volvo, virtually identical to Martin's Volvo, which shortly after had also tried to exit Port Arthur. At the time it was observed, and even the owners of that vehicle were approached and told to be cautious about driving that vehicle anywhere near police in case the reports had gone out that the gunman was in a yellow Volvo and that their Volvo may have been mistaken. Now, once again, there are more than one vehicle that exist, and it's of course possible that someone could own another yellow Volvo and drive that on the day, but it once again is another coincidence that supports a synchronicity of events. In regards to other coincidences at the time, there was also, the coroner's office had also requested the construction of some refrigeration units which were to be installed at the department for the coroner's office to be able to refrigerate a large area in case there was a need to store a large amount of bodies. There was a report that was issued by the coroner's office where they basically said that this was very beneficial to the office, and whether it was a slip of the tongue, but the wording was that they said they were very pleased with the delivery of these refrigeration units in time ready for the incident. Once again, could have just been a slip of the tongue, but it just is an odd way to basically acknowledge the pre-delivery of something that would then later on be used to treat the victims from Port Arthur. There are many, many more coincidences. All of these are on file and able to be accessed. And basically, though they may not necessarily prove that there was foreknowledge of Port Arthur, there are strong indications and many, many multiple occasions that suggest that there was some kind of pre-planning and perhaps pre-knowledge of what was to take place at Port Arthur on Sunday the 28th of April 1996. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.